I'm Flora Richardson, 34, and I built a national nonprofit that's helped over 2,000 veterans get housed. For years, I put my life on hold to care for my father, a decorated Army vet who never seemed to see me. But when he called me a deadbeat in front of his old platoon, I made a decision that changed everything. Ever been dismissed by someone you sacrificed everything for? If you have, drop your story in the comments. You're not the only one. Before I tell you what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to walk away to protect your peace, hit like and subscribe. Because what came next, no one saw coming. My name is Flora Richardson, and if you'd asked anyone in my family, they'd tell you I was the dependable one. The daughter who showed up. The one who remembered birthdays, balanced her checkbook, and never caused trouble. My dad, Colonel Gerald Richardson, retired Army, 27 years of service, 3 tours overseas, and a jawline like it was chiseled from stone, raised us like we were still on base, even after we moved to a sleepy suburb in Virginia. You made your bed every morning, you finished what you started, and if you cried, you did it quietly and with your back straight. My brothers, Aaron and Jacob, followed his path without hesitation. Enlisted before they were 20. They had matching buzz cuts by the time they could drive. Growing up, the house was wallpapered with their achievements. Framed certificates. Photos in uniform. Medals pinned above the fireplace like family heirlooms. When I said I was thinking about majoring in political science, Dad blinked like he hadn't heard me right. Not nursing? Not ROTC, he asked, as if those were the only 2 legitimate options. Still, I never rebelled. I couldn't afford to. My mom died when I was 11, and after that, Dad hardened in a way that never softened. His grief became routine, strictness dialed to 10, emotions dialed to 0. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. One look could freeze the blood in your veins. In high school, I followed the rules, kept my head down, earned a partial scholarship to a small liberal arts college. Dad didn't come to the open house or help me move in. "You've got this," he said, handing me a check for $500, which I later learned came from my mom's old emergency fund, not from him. I found work in the campus library, picked up tutoring hours on the side, and somehow managed to keep a 3.9 GPA while juggling 2 jobs. Meanwhile, my brothers were home on leave every few months, welcomed like heroes. Dad would cook their favorite meals, set out the good china, insist we all watch old war movies in the living room like it was tradition. When I brought up my upcoming internship in DC, he nodded once, then changed the subject to Jacob's marksmanship scores. I stopped trying after a while. It just felt easier. But things shifted the year I graduated. Aaron was stationed overseas and Jacob had just been promoted to staff sergeant. Dad slipped on a patch of ice in the driveway, fractured his hip, and suddenly everything fell apart. He hated hospitals, refused rehab, and dismissed home care as a waste of taxpayer money. I'd been offered a fellowship in Denver with a nonprofit focused on public sector reform, a dream opportunity, but within 2 days of Dad's accident, I'd turned it down, packed my bags, and moved back into my childhood bedroom. I told myself it would be temporary, just until he was back on his feet. That first month, I took over everything. Drove him to the VA for follow-ups, filled prescriptions, argued with the insurance rep who kept misfiling his paperwork. I cooked, cleaned, and fielded his calls when he couldn't reach the phone in time. He never once said thank you. Not directly. The closest he got was, "You're good with logistics." That's something. I tried to brush it off. Dad wasn't wired for sentiment. But it stung in ways I didn't expect. I watched the way he lit up when Aaron called from Qatar, or when Jacob dropped by on weekends in uniform. He'd sit up straighter, speak more clearly, even laugh. With me, it was different. Less like I was his daughter and more like I was a live-in assistant. After a few months, I asked him if he'd consider part-time physical therapy to regain his mobility. "You're here," he replied. "That's therapy enough." He said it like a compliment. Like being needed should be a reward. I started keeping a notebook, just to track things. Appointments, meds, expenses. But it turned into more than that. I'd jot down comments he made. Things like, "You're not like your brothers. You don't have follow-through," when I brought up wanting to apply to grad school. Or, civilians just don't get it, whenever I disagreed with one of his opinions about the world. I'd read back those lines at night, trying to figure out if I was imagining it. If maybe I was too sensitive. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. He called me reliable when talking to others, but never in front of me. He introduced me to his friends as my daughter Flora. She works with nonprofits or something. Like what I did didn't quite register as real work. At family cookouts, he'd pull Jacob aside to talk strategy or discipline, then glance at me and ask if I could check on the burgers. By the end of that year, I'd missed 2 birthdays, 1 job offer, and 3 networking conferences. When I brought it up, casually, cautiously, he reminded me that family comes first. You can build a career anytime, he said. But your father only breaks a hip once. That might have been funny if it weren't so telling. The second year at home blurred into the first. I started freelancing remotely, grant writing for nonprofits to keep my resume from gathering dust. Every time I hinted that I might start interviewing again, Dad would find a new reason I needed to stay. My back's acting up, or the VA's switching my provider again. Can you handle the paperwork? He'd never say it directly. He didn't have to. The message was always clear. Your role is here. When Jacob came back from deployment and decided to propose to his girlfriend, Dad lit up like a Christmas tree. That boy's doing everything right, he told me over dinner. Stability, service, family. Proud doesn't even cover it. I nodded, smiled, said congratulations. Then I excused myself, went upstairs, and sat on the edge of my childhood bed wondering how many years of my life I'd spent earning pride that was never meant for me. I wasn't bitter. At least, not then. I told myself this was what daughters did. We helped. We filled in gaps. We showed up when it mattered. And maybe, eventually, someone noticed. But with Dad, noticing was always conditional. You had to match the image in his mind. Fit the mold. And I didn't. I never had. That truth had been sitting quietly in the corner of every room for as long as I could remember. I just didn't want to look at it until it started speaking louder than I could ignore. And the moment that finally broke it wide open, the moment he called me a deadbeat in front of a room full of men he respected, that was when I stopped pretending I hadn't heard it all along. But that's getting ahead of things. Because before that moment came the buildup. The history. The slow, quiet erosion of a relationship built more on duty than recognition. And the cracks had been forming for years. I just hadn't let myself feel the full weight of them, not yet. Not until it was too loud to drown out. As my brothers advanced in rank and started building their lives, mortgages, wives, matching golden retrievers, my dad's tone toward me began to shift in a way that was hard to pin down at first. It wasn't that he suddenly disliked me. It was more like I became irrelevant. The updates I gave him about my work, projects I was proud of, grants we'd secured, community impact, landed with a dull thud. He'd nod, vaguely, then pivot back to Jacob's latest commendation or Aaron's new deployment. He never said it outright, but I could feel the comparison floating in the silence between us. Like I was a placeholder. Like I was there because someone had to be, not because I brought anything worth talking about. Once, when I mentioned we were hosting a veterans housing summit through my nonprofit, he blinked. You still doing that volunteering thing? I'm the director, I said. It's a salaried position. Sure, he said, then added, must be nice to have so much free time. That was his new line, delivered with that half-smirk he used when he thought he was being clever. He'd toss it out when I came back from a site visit or when I mentioned meeting with a city official about expanding transitional housing services. And it wasn't just him. His friends followed his lead. One Sunday, a few of his old Platoon guys dropped by. He'd set out beer and pretzels like it was game day, even though the TV stayed off. The talk was loud and familiar, Army stories on loop, names I only half remembered, laughs that turned into coughs. I hovered on the edge of the room, clearing glasses and trying not to be too present. At one point, one of the men, retired, silver crew cut, standard issue polo shirt, turned to me and asked, "You still between jobs, sweetheart?" Before I could answer, my dad chuckled. She's finding herself. I looked at him, waiting for a correction. Nothing came. I actually run a nonprofit for homeless veterans, I said quietly. The man blinked. Oh. Huh. Then he turned back to his beer. I didn't say another word that evening. Just sat in the kitchen, listening through the wall as my dad held court. The stories were the same ones I'd heard since childhood, but now they sounded different. Like reminders. Like proof of a standard I would never meet. He had a new fixation by then too, Captain Rhys Delaney. Delaney had been all over the news. Silver Star recipient, lead of a high-profile search and rescue mission overseas, best-selling author of a memoir titled No Excuses. He was the face of what my dad considered the last real military generation. Young, square-jawed, and somehow both polished and weathered. My dad watched every interview, highlighted passages in his book, and started quoting him the way other dads quoted Churchill or Patton. You hear what Delaney said last week, he'd ask over dinner, like I'd subscribed to some internal newsletter. That's a man who gets it. Discipline. Loyalty. No whining. Once, I made the mistake of suggesting that maybe Delaney's story was a little sanitized. That the media only shows us what we already want to believe. My dad's face didn't move, but something behind his eyes hardened. It's easy to criticize when you've never had to lead men into battle, he said. Some people talk. Others do. I went quiet after that. The line was clear. Criticism wasn't disagreement, it was disloyalty. The deeper he fell into that world, Delaney's memoirs, VA newsletters, reunions with his old unit, the more he seemed to shrink me down. At first it was small things. Calling my office your little HQ. Asking if I'd thought about getting back into the workforce, as though everything I was building didn't count. When I pointed out that our nonprofit had just been awarded a state contract, he shrugged. That's nice. But you know it's not exactly battlefield stress. He said it like I was pretending. Like helping veterans reintegrate, managing crisis teams, coordinating emergency housing, none of it qualified as real service. I tried to find neutral ground. Bought him tickets to a veterans conference where one of our team members was speaking. He left halfway through the keynote. Said it felt too soft. Said the crowd was full of people who want to feel good about themselves without actually doing anything. When I reminded him I was one of those people, he didn't answer. Around that time, I noticed he'd started referring to me differently when talking to people on the phone. He used to say, my daughter, Flora, she's in community services. Now it was just, she's figuring things out. Like I was 19 and undecided. Not 31 with a master's degree and 6 years of experience managing a growing nonprofit. I wish I could say I confronted him. That I told him he was being dismissive, that I deserved better. But I didn't. I just kept showing up. Paying the bills he forgot about. Taking his car in for servicing. Submitting his disability paperwork again when it got rejected for a clerical error. I did it because it needed to be done. And part of me still hoped it would count for something. But it never did. He never asked how I managed to do it all while running an organization. He never asked if I was tired or if I needed help. He assumed I'd always be there. Quiet, dependable, and invisible. The cracks became harder to ignore during a reunion planning meeting for his old platoon. He was hosting part of the event, something he'd taken very seriously. I helped book the venue, manage RSVPs, and coordinate with vendors. He never thanked me, not once. Just barked out requests like I was his assistant. When I tried to clarify something about the dinner schedule, he waved me off. Just do what Delaney does, he said, not looking up from his notepad. You've read the book. Keep it tight, no frills. I hadn't read the book. The final straw came during a conversation I overheard. He was on the phone with an old friend, someone I barely remembered. They were talking about Jacob's promotion and Aaron's new station assignment. And then the friend must have asked about me, because my dad said, Flora? She's not military. She helps out where she can. He paused. Then laughing, yeah, still a bit of a deadbeat. Deadbeat. The word landed in my chest like a dropped anchor. I stood in the hallway frozen, hand still clutching the laundry basket I'd been carrying. He didn't know I could hear him. And he didn't try to correct himself or soften it with a joke. Just said it like it was fact. I didn't say anything. I didn't march in or slam a door or yell. I just walked back to my room, set the basket down, and sat on the bed. It wasn't the insult that broke me. It was the ease with which he said it. Like that was the version of me he'd been carrying around all along. Not his daughter. Not the one who stayed. Just the non-military placeholder who hadn't earned a real identity in his eyes. The irony, of course, is that I'd built my career helping men like him, combat veterans discarded by the system, looking for dignity. I'd advocated for them, raised funding, created programs tailored to their needs. I'd listened to their stories when no one else had time. But to him, I was still the one who didn't serve. Still the one who hadn't earned my stripes. And that, more than anything, told me exactly where I stood. The reunion dinner was held in one of those dimly lit banquet halls attached to a mid-tier hotel off the interstate. The kind of place with stiff white tablecloths, lukewarm buffet trays, and American flags draped over folding chairs. A large banner hung near the entrance. 3rd Battalion, Echo Company. Brotherhood never fades. I'd offered to help set up, coordinate the catering, or handle the name tags, but Dad waved me off. Come as a guest, for once, he said. It's important you just enjoy the night. I remember being surprised by that. Flattered, even. Maybe he finally wanted me there as family, not just support staff. When I arrived, most of the tables were already filled with men in their 60s and 70s, some in dress shirts, some in full uniform, others in polos embroidered with unit insignia. They looked at each other with a kind of reverence I didn't understand. The bond of shared danger. I saw it, even if I wasn't part of it. Dad was already seated when I walked in, flanked by 2 of his closest army friends. He nodded when he saw me, but didn't get up. I took my seat quietly, trying not to feel like an outsider at my own father's table. Dinner started with the usual formalities, a short speech from the organizer, a moment of silence for the fallen, and then trays of food that were more functional than flavorful. I picked at my plate while the men around me swapped stories that blurred together. Desert heat. Bad rations. Men who'd saved lives and lost parts of themselves. I listened politely, clapping when others clapped, laughing when someone told a harmless joke. Mostly, I stayed quiet. Halfway through the meal, someone brought up family. It started innocently enough. A man across the table, Mike, I think his name was, asked about my brothers. How's Jacob doing? Still stationed in San Diego. Dad perked up. Yep. Just got promoted. He's heading a new logistics unit next month. And Aaron? Still overseas. 3rd rotation. Man's built for it. Mike nodded, impressed. That's solid. You did good, Jerry. Dad smiled, leaned back in his chair. Then someone else asked about me. And your daughter? It was one of the quieter guys at the end of the table, squinting at me like he vaguely remembered who I was. My father didn't hesitate. My boys are killing it, he said proudly. And my daughter? Well, he chuckled. She's kind of a deadbeat. Laughter rippled across the table. Not the polite kind. Not the kind people offer when they don't get the joke but want to keep the mood light. Real laughter. Knowing. Comfortable. As if I'd been the punchline before. I didn't move. I just sat there, holding my fork, staring at a plate I had no appetite for. No one looked at me, not even my father. Especially not him. He just kept his gaze forward, like I wasn't sitting right there. Like I hadn't been the one who'd driven him to every medical appointment for the last 18 months. Like I wasn't the one who'd stepped in when no one else had. I tried to swallow the burn rising in my throat. To remind myself that it was just a bad joke. That he didn't mean it. But he did. That was the part one couldn't explain away. And then I stood up. I didn't make a scene. I didn't slam anything or storm out. I just pushed my chair back, quietly, and walked toward the exit. My hands were shaking. I wasn't even sure where I was going. I just knew I couldn't sit there another second. Not in that room. Not with those people. But before I could reach the door, they opened. A hush fell over the room as everyone turned. The guest of honor had arrived. Captain Rhys Delaney. Even in person, he looked like a headline. Tall, straight-backed, sharply dressed in a tailored navy suit with the kind of presence that made people straighten up without realizing it. His reputation had preceded him, multiple tours, major commendations, and a book that made the rounds in every military household I knew. He paused just inside the doorway, scanning the room like he was back in formation. And then his eyes landed on me. He stopped. His expression didn't change, no surprise, no smile, but something in his posture shifted. He took a step forward slowly, like he was considering something. Then he raised his hand and delivered a crisp, deliberate salute. Right at me. I heard chairs shuffle behind me. Forks set down. The room went silent. My first thought was that he'd mistaken me for someone else. That maybe he was saluting someone behind me. But there was no one. Just me, standing there in a dark blue dress I'd pulled from the back of my closet, trying to hold myself together after being publicly humiliated by my own father. I didn't salute back. I just stood there, stunned, as he lowered his hand and gave me a subtle nod. Then he walked past without a word, heading straight for the head table like nothing had happened. The rest of the room slowly came back to life. Quiet murmurs. Shifting chairs. A few uncertain glances in my direction. But my father? He stayed seated. He never looked at me. Not once. I walked out. In the hallway, the air felt cooler. Quieter. I leaned against the wall near the coat racks and tried to breathe. My pulse was still thudding in my ears, but there was something else now. Something I couldn't quite name yet. Validation, maybe. It wasn't that Delaney had seen me. He didn't know me. But in that moment, his gesture had cut through years of being dismissed, diminished, and overlooked. He saw something worth acknowledging. And somehow, he knew I needed it. I stayed out there for 15 minutes. Long enough to make sure I didn't cry in front of anyone. Long enough to feel my legs stop shaking. When I finally walked to my car, I didn't look back at the building. I didn't want to give it that much power. Later that night, I got a text from Jacob. Heard Delaney saluted you? What was that about? I didn't reply. The next morning, Dad didn't bring it up. No explanation. No apology. Just his usual routine, black coffee, newspaper folded just so, the television low in the background playing cable news. As if the night before had never happened. But I remembered. I remembered the laughter. I remembered the way he didn't even flinch when he called me a deadbeat. And I remembered the silence that followed a single salute from a man who owed me nothing, but offered more respect in 10 seconds than my father had in 10 years. It changed something in me. Not instantly. Not loudly. But permanently. Because once someone sees you clearly, even for a moment, it becomes harder to accept being invisible. Even to the people you once hoped would notice. I ended up staying through the rest of the dinner. Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't want to give anyone the satisfaction of watching me leave. The room had settled back into its usual rhythm, conversation, silverware scraping plates, low music humming from a speaker in the corner. But the air felt different. Like the moment had left a residue no one wanted to name. I sat stiffly at the table, pushing food around my plate without tasting any of it. The laughter from earlier kept replaying in my mind, how easy it was for them. How comfortable they all seemed, laughing at a version of me my father had created. The room hadn't turned on him. No one called it out. They just accepted it. Laughed, ate, and moved on. He didn't apologize. Didn't pull me aside. He didn't even look at me. I stayed seated through the speeches, the closing remarks, the thank yous. I nodded when people glanced my way. Smiled when necessary. It was easier than trying to explain why I was hollow inside. When the event wrapped up, most people migrated toward the open bar near the back. My father disappeared into a cluster of old friends, shaking hands and telling stories like nothing had happened. I was folding my napkin when I felt a presence beside me. It was Captain Delaney. Up close, he looked exactly like his press photos, sharp, calm, and focused in a way that made everything around him feel suddenly quiet. He didn't sit. Just stood next to my chair for a moment, hands in his pockets. You're the one who runs that Veterans Housing Initiative, right? I looked up at him, surprised. Yes. I'm the director of Horizon Outreach. He nodded once, then extended his hand. I've read your work. He said it without flourish. No smile, no embellishment. Just a simple statement, like it was obvious. Like he saw the connection between the policy briefs I'd written and the programs we'd built from scratch. I shook his hand. His grip was firm, respectful. Then he left. Just like that. My father never noticed. Or if he did, he didn't acknowledge it. I didn't wait for goodbyes. I walked out alone and made it to my car without breaking pace. I sat in the driver's seat for nearly an hour. Engine off. Hands in my lap. Just sitting. I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry in the loud, explosive way people think anger looks. I was tired. Tired in a way that went bone deep. Like something old inside me had finally burned out. I kept thinking about all the paperwork I'd filled out for my dad over the last 2 years. The countless phone calls with the VA, the missed lunch breaks, the hours I spent advocating for his disability claims, arguing with bureaucrats, sending appeals. I'd built an entire part of my organization around helping veterans like him navigate that broken system. I knew the codes, the acronyms, the loopholes. I knew how to speak their language because I'd learned it for him. The irony wasn't lost on me. That night, the man who called me a deadbeat had been protected and supported by the very infrastructure I'd helped design. He was receiving care through a system I fought every day to improve. And still, I didn't count. That salute didn't erase the pain. It didn't fix anything. But it clarified something I'd been refusing to see. My worth wasn't invisible. It was just invisible to him. That distinction mattered. The next morning, I opened my laptop and logged into our internal database. We had 3 housing applications in the pipeline, 2 grant proposals pending, and a city council meeting on the books for Friday. I didn't mention the reunion to my team. I didn't need to. They already treated me like a leader. With respect. With clarity. The only person I'd ever tried to prove myself to, the one who refused to see it, was my father. That realization settled over me like cold water. I had been measuring my value against a broken ruler. His approval had become my finish line. Every achievement, every sacrifice, I was still hoping he'd one day look at me and see something worth admiring. But that wasn't going to happen. Later that week, I talked to Zoe, one of our senior case managers. We were walking back from a site visit when she asked how the reunion went. I hesitated. He called me a deadbeat. In front of his platoon. She stopped mid-step. You're kidding. No. It wasn't even subtle. Her face tightened. That's beyond disrespect. I nodded. Captain Delaney was there. He saluted me. Zoe blinked. Wait, that Delaney? Yeah. What did your dad say about that? Nothing. She didn't respond right away. Just gave me a look that said more than words could. In the days that followed, I noticed my routine started to shift. Small things mostly. I stopped taking calls from the VA on his behalf. I forwarded them to my brothers. I left his mail unopened for 2 days before finally handing it to him. I stopped checking the kitchen for his favorite brand of coffee. I wasn't trying to be vindictive. I was just letting go. There was a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying until I started setting it down. And underneath it, there was space. For my work. For people who saw me. For a version of myself that didn't need to beg for recognition. I kept remembering the moment Delaney looked at me, how quickly he had seen something my father never did. Not because he owed me anything, but because he knew what the work looked like. He understood service didn't always wear a uniform. A few nights later, I was organizing a proposal binder for a new funding cycle when my phone buzzed. It was a group chat, my dad, Jacob, and Aaron. A message from Dad, reminder, I have my VA physical on Monday. Flora, can you handle the paperwork in advance? I stared at the message for a while. Then I typed, Jacob, you've got the contact information for his provider. You can take it from here. There was a pause. Then Jacob responded with a thumbs-up emoji. Dad didn't reply. That was the first time I'd handed off something without guilt. Not out of spite. Not because I wanted to punish him. But because I realized I didn't need to prove my value by fixing everything for him anymore. That night, I stood at my window, looking out over the city. The lights stretched for miles, tiny, flickering, anonymous. Somewhere out there were people I'd helped. Veterans who'd slept indoors because of our housing project. Families reunited. Benefits expedited. Systems reformed. And none of it had required his approval. I didn't need a banner. I didn't need applause. I just needed to stop giving pieces of myself to someone who never asked what it cost. That was the beginning. Not of bitterness, but of clarity. He could keep his jokes. His silence. His version of me. I was done carrying it. The first thing I stopped doing was restocking his fridge. It seemed small, but it wasn't. For almost 2 years, I'd tracked his grocery list like a second job, reading the labels he couldn't, organizing freezer meals for bad pain days, making sure the brand of peanut butter he liked was always in the cabinet because the other stuff tastes like glue. I knew his system. I built half of it. But after that night, the laugh, the silence, the salute, I walked into his kitchen one last time, saw the empty egg carton and the sink full of dishes, and didn't lift a finger. I left a sticky note on the counter. You'll need to pick up a few things. The list is on the fridge. And I walked out. The next morning, I forwarded his upcoming medical appointments to his VA caseworker and copied my brothers on the email. I'm stepping back from managing Dad's care. Please coordinate with Ms. Bennett directly for anything related to his file. Jacob called first. His tone was caught somewhere between concern and frustration. Flora, what's going on? Did something happen? I didn't explain the whole thing. I didn't talk about the dinner, or the insult, or the years of small slights that added up to something too heavy to carry. I just can't do it anymore, I said. You and Aaron can manage from here. He paused. Look, he's old school. You know that. He doesn't think before he speaks. I'm not asking him to be poetic, I said. Just decent. Jacob exhaled like I was the one being unreasonable. You've always been the organized one. He counts on you. Yeah, I said flatly. He does. Aaron texted later that day. He's still your father. I didn't respond. Dad finally called 3 days later. I let it go to voicemail. His message was short. You don't have to make a point like this, Flora. It's petty. You're better than that. No apology. Just judgment wrapped in disappointment. I saved the voicemail and didn't listen to it again. In the weeks that followed, the cracks started to show. Ms. Bennett emailed twice to let me know Dad had missed an eligibility deadline for one of his prescription subsidies. He forgot to reschedule his physical therapy. His fridge, I heard from Jacob, sat nearly empty the last time he visited. None of it surprised me. For almost 2 years, I'd made his life easier. Seamless, even. Not because I wanted to be seen as a hero, but because it felt like the right thing to do. But it had never been enough to earn his respect. That realization had settled in deep. And now I was just done. Not angry. Not vindictive. Just done. Zoe noticed the difference right away. You're breathing easier, she said one morning, sliding a cup of coffee across my desk. Feels weird not juggling his schedule on top of mine. You're allowed to choose peace. I nodded. Took me too long to figure that out. With the time and energy I reclaimed, I started doubling down on Horizon's expansion plan. We'd been trying to launch a second outreach site in the northern part of the state, closer to a cluster of underserved veteran communities, but funding had been tight and bandwidth even tighter. Now I had both. I revised our proposal, met with donors, drove upstate to tour available properties. The momentum that had once been drained by constant caretaking was finally turning outward. And people noticed. At our quarterly board meeting, our development director, Shauna, pulled me aside. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. You've been sharper these last few weeks. Clearer. I didn't mention the reunion. I just smiled and said I stopped fighting a battle I couldn't win. By mid-spring, the proposal was approved. We signed a lease on a modest office near an old National Guard facility, and our volunteer coordinator began staffing the satellite team. It wasn't flashy, but it was functional, and it would help people. That's all I ever wanted. Meanwhile, my father adapted. Poorly, but predictably. He started calling Jacob more often. Then Aaron. When they didn't answer, he'd call Ms. Bennett and complain about how no one's keeping him in the loop. When she reminded him that I'd delegated everything to her weeks ago, he grunted and hung up. Eventually, he started handling some things himself. Ordering his own refills. Scheduling his checkups. He was capable, if unwilling. Always had been. What he really missed was the convenience. And the control. At first, I kept tabs from a distance. Quietly. Just in case. But over time, I stopped checking. The urge to micromanage faded, replaced by something steadier. Not satisfaction. Not revenge. just relief. I didn't need to be the family savior anymore. At the start of summer, we hosted a veteran appreciation night at our new outreach center. Nothing fancy. Just folding chairs, barbecue from a local place, and a slideshow of our client success stories. I gave a short welcome speech and stayed late to help clean up. When I finally got home, there was a voicemail waiting. It was Dad. I heard about the new office. Someone forwarded me the announcement. Seems like a big deal. A long pause. I'm glad it's working out. No acknowledgement of the dinner. No apology for the insult. Just a half step towards something. Maybe that was all he could give. But the truth was, I didn't need it. I had built something real, tangible, impactful. And I had done it while carrying weight he'd never even noticed. Now, without that weight, I was running faster, thinking clearer, moving forward. A few days later, Jacob sent me a photo, Dad's living room, with a copy of the local paper folded open to a short article about Horizon's expansion. Guess he's reading up, Jacob wrote. I didn't reply. It wasn't a victory lap. It wasn't proof that he finally saw me. It was just a moment. A small shift. But I wasn't looking for his recognition anymore. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't trying to be worthy of his version of success. I was living mine. And that decision, to stop showing up, to pull back my energy and invest it where it mattered, did more for my future than any apology ever could. 3 months after I stepped away from my father's care, Horizon Outreach secured a partnership with the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It started as a pilot, small scale, 6 counties, limited funds, but it came with federal recognition, logistical resources, and enough visibility to open doors that had always been closed. I was invited to present at a regional summit on veteran homelessness that spring. I prepared obsessively, mapped out every data point, every case study, every program outcome. I stood at the podium in a room of decision-makers and told them how we had cut veteran street homelessness by 42% in our target region, how we'd done it with minimal funding and a team that had once fit around a single folding table. The applause was polite but sincere. Afterward, a woman in a black blazer with a state seal on her badge shook my hand and said, "You don't talk like an executive director. You talk like someone who's actually done the work." I have, I said. From the ground up. 2 weeks later, I was on a panel at a National Veterans Policy Conference in D.C., and this time, Captain Delaney was on the roster. He found me backstage before the event, nodding like we'd known each other longer than just one quiet moment in a crowded banquet hall. "You're everywhere lately," he said, and it wasn't a complaint. I smiled, trying to be useful. He laughed once. "You're past that. You're shaping the landscape." That panel changed everything. Delaney opened with a story about a Marine who'd fallen through the cracks. No support, no job, no housing. What saved him, he said, was a woman running a nonprofit out of a strip mall office in Virginia. She didn't wait for the system to catch up. She built a new one. Then he pointed to me. "She's here today. Flora Richardson, Horizon Outreach." The room turned. It wasn't just acknowledgement, it was endorsement. From someone my father idolized. Someone the room respected. After the event, people lined up to talk. Program directors. Funders. Press. For the first time, I didn't feel like I had to justify what I did. I just had to explain how we did it. Delaney introduced me to a federal coordinator at Veterans Affairs. "Anything she needs," he told the man. "You take the call." He didn't owe me any of that. But he did it anyway. Back home, I kept my head down and kept working. We added 5 new counties to the housing initiative, opened a second satellite office, and doubled our staff. I delegated more. Trained our managers. Took time to mentor new hires the way I wish someone had mentored me years ago. The ripple effect was real. And my father? He started fading. It happened slowly, quietly at first. Fewer calls from old Platoon friends. Less interest in organizing the annual reunion. When the planning committee for Echo Company's summer barbecue formed a group chat, they added Jacob, not him. I didn't gloat. I didn't even react. But I noticed. He wasn't the center of their conversations anymore. His stories had been told too many times. His bitterness, once laughed off, had started to wear thin. When he made offhand comments about kids these days not knowing real sacrifice, people stopped nodding. They changed the subject. Left the room. Jacob mentioned it one afternoon over coffee. They've been asking about you, actually. Some of Dad's friends. Wanting to know how you're getting all these programs funded. I raised an eyebrow. He shrugged. I think they're realizing the old war stories don't pay the rent. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. My father never brought up the conferences or the articles or the growing reach of Horizon Outreach. But I knew he saw it. A local newspaper ran a feature on our work with at-risk veterans. The article included a photo of me with our staff, standing in front of a renovated housing unit. Someone had mailed him a clipping. He left it on the kitchen table for days. He never mentioned it. The same week, he left a voicemail on my work phone. Just checking in. Heard you're doing well. Guess the nonprofit's keeping you busy. No, I'm proud of you. No, I was wrong. Just a shadow of something. Maybe regret. Maybe just discomfort. Meanwhile, my brothers kept up their lives. Aaron's second child was on the way. Jacob transferred to a logistics unit closer to home. They visited Dad when they could, but the rhythm had changed. The dependency he once masked as pride wasn't masked anymore. He needed things. Rides. Forms. Appointments. They helped when they could. But not with the consistency he'd had from me. He noticed. And that loneliness, the slow erosion of being needed, started to show. He began asking Jacob for advice. Things he used to pretend to know already. He started forgetting dates, misplacing bills, missing follow-ups. He left a heating bill unpaid for 2 months and blamed the mail. But still, I didn't go back. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because I had finally learned that proximity isn't loyalty, and being needed isn't the same as being respected. I had given everything for years, energy, time, patience, and he hadn't noticed until it was gone. Now, I was investing those things where they created value. We hosted our first national summit for community-based veteran services that fall. Over 100 organizations attended. Delaney opened the event. I gave the closing speech. Our impact report was published the same week, 63% reduction in veteran homelessness across our service region. The night before the summit, I stood in my office alone, looking at the framed photo on the wall. It was the same picture from the article, me and my team in front of that first unit we restored. Behind us, an older veteran leaned out the window with a peace sign. That photo reminded me of what mattered. Not validation. Not revenge. Change. And I'd made it. My father called again after the summit. Left another voicemail. Just wanted to say, good job. That's all. It should have felt like something. But it didn't. It just confirmed what I already knew. I didn't need his approval anymore. I'd outgrown the version of success he respected. From a distance, I watched the life he built, order, rank, medals, start to hollow out. Not from scandal or disgrace. Just from time. From the slow realization that authority doesn't age well when it's not accompanied by humility. He still wore his service like armor. But it no longer commanded the room. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm. Because the peace I'd been chasing for so long wasn't tied to his recognition. It was tied to the moment I stopped chasing altogether. There's something freeing about watching the past let go of you for once. And for the first time in my life, I let it. The message came through Jacob one afternoon. We were both at a family birthday, one of the nephews, plastic tablecloths and store-bought cupcakes, when he pulled me aside on the porch. He said something, Jacob muttered. Dad. I didn't say anything. Said, I didn't know she was doing all that. About the work. The programs. Delaney. Everything. I nodded once. Noted. Jacob looked at me, waiting. That's it? What do you want me to say? I don't know. It's something. Barely. He didn't argue. Just let it hang in the air between us. Later that night, I sent a message to Jacob. Simple. If he wants to talk, he can reach out himself. Weeks passed. Nothing came. And then a voicemail. I recognized the number before it finished ringing. His tone was different, quieter, like he was leaning away from the receiver instead of into it. I read that article someone sent me. The one where you talked about the outreach programs and the new pilot. I didn't realize all that. I didn't say it before, but I'm proud. I am. There was a long pause. I guess I didn't see it. That's all. He hung up without saying goodbye. I didn't return the call. Not right away. I let it sit for a few days. Not out of malice, but because I needed to figure out what it meant, what I was willing to take from it, and what I wasn't. When I finally called him back, I kept it brief. We talked logistics, a medication delivery that had been rerouted, a form he wasn't sure how to submit online. He asked a few questions. I answered them. Polite. Efficient. When he thanked me, I said, "You're welcome." And that was it. I didn't open the door wide. But I didn't shut it either. We spoke once more that month. Again, it was about something practical, insurance coverage, I think. He didn't bring up the past, and I didn't ask for it. There were no sweeping apologies. No emotional reckoning. Just a kind of quiet recalibration. He'd started to notice, I think, that the ground had shifted. That I wasn't standing where I used to be. The version of me he remembered, the one always available, always agreeable, always trying to prove her worth, she was gone. In her place was someone who picked up the phone when she chose to, not because she was expected to. I told Zoe about the call. We were walking through one of the newer transitional housing sites, inspecting the final touches before our opening weekend. Sounds like progress, she said, kicking a stray paint chip off the front step. Maybe. Or maybe it's just age. She nodded. Sometimes people soften when they realize no one's waiting on them to change anymore. That stuck with me. Because I hadn't been waiting. I'd moved on. Built a life around something sturdier than his approval. And somehow, in that absence, he was starting to see what he'd missed. Not everything, but something. We established a rhythm over the next couple of months. Occasional calls, mostly initiated by him. He never overstayed on the line. Never asked for more than I was willing to give. And for the first time in our relationship, I wasn't anticipating disappointment. I was managing expectations. At one point, he asked about the conference I was flying to, a national policy roundtable. I told him I'd be on a panel about federal housing reform. Huh, he said. Didn't know you were doing all that. I've been doing it for years. He didn't challenge that. Just said, that's good work. Real good. The compliment landed awkwardly. Like a language he hadn't spoken in years. But he tried. And I let it sit. I didn't offer stories or updates unless he asked. I didn't send him articles or include him in board announcements. Not out of spite, but because the boundary had been set. If he wanted to be part of this world, he had to walk toward it. I wouldn't drag him in. He asked about the staff one time, if I still worked with that woman from the case management team. You mean Zoe? I said. Yeah, her. She's our director of programs now. He paused. She's good. Always thought she was sharp. I smiled. She is. That was the shape our conversations took. Tentative, pragmatic, but with fewer landmines. He never said, "I'm sorry." And I stopped needing him to. Because what I needed more was the space to decide, on my own terms, whether this relationship was something I wanted to carry forward or something I had finally outgrown. So I set limits. I didn't go back to managing his schedule. I didn't take over his mail or his medical charts. When he asked for help, I gave him options. Not my time, not my labor, just information. That was the line. He seemed to understand that now. One afternoon, he asked if I'd ever want to have coffee. Somewhere neutral, he said, like we were negotiating a ceasefire. I'll think about it, I told him. And I meant it. I asked myself, quietly, what I wanted from that kind of meeting. Not closure. Not reconciliation. Just clarity. A sense of whether he was here to build something new or simply to be less alone. Either way, it wasn't my job to manage his transformation. Only to protect mine. A few weeks later, I agreed to meet him at a diner halfway between our neighborhoods. It was late morning. Quiet. We talked about neutral things, the weather, the coffee, how loud the road construction had gotten near his street. He asked a few questions about work. I answered in simple terms. He nodded along. There were no speeches. No big reveals. But at one point, he said, "You were right to step back. I didn't see what you were doing, but that's on me. I should have." It wasn't a full apology, but it was more than I'd ever gotten. I didn't offer forgiveness. Just said, okay. We finished our coffee. He paid the bill without asking. And when we stood to leave, he held the door open, then paused and said, "You don't owe me anything, Flora. But I'm trying." That part I believed. Not because it was smooth or practiced, but because it was clumsy. Honest. We parted ways in the parking lot. No promises. No follow-up plans. But he walked a few steps slower than usual. Like he wasn't quite ready to leave the moment. Neither was I. Not because it was warm, but because it was real. And real after everything was enough. This year, Horizon Outreach passed a milestone I never imagined when we were running intake interviews out of a shared office above a laundromat, over 2,000 veterans housed. Families stabilized. Lives redirected. Numbers on a page, yes, but each one tied to a real person. A name. A story. The national office runs out of DC now. We have full-time policy analysts, a data team, 3 regional field directors. I still make site visits when I can, still sit in on some of the late-night calls when we're troubleshooting with local municipalities. But the work moves with or without me now. That's what real infrastructure looks like. It's not built around a single person. Still, they gave me an award this spring, a national leadership recognition from the Department of Veterans Affairs. I was flown in, put up at a nice hotel, ushered through a photo line before the ceremony. I wore a charcoal blazer. Neutral makeup. Small earrings. No family in the crowd. At the pre-ceremony reception, someone from the vet committee leaned in and asked, "Will your family be attending tonight?" I smiled. "No," she paused. "Well, they must be proud." "I'm sure they are," I said. And I meant it. But I wasn't waiting to hear it anymore. The room filled slowly that evening. Military brass. Cabinet staff. Advocates. Veterans in pressed suits and polished shoes, wearing old pins with quiet pride. When they called my name, I walked to the stage, accepted the plaque, and stood under the lights for a moment longer than necessary. The applause was warm. Steady. A standing ovation. I looked out at the rows of people who'd shown up, not for me personally, but for the work. The mission. The proof that it mattered. I spoke for 4 minutes. No script. I talked about systems. About clarity. About the dignity of showing up even when the world doesn't give you credit. I mentioned one of our first clients, an Air Force mechanic who spent his first night in our housing unit clutching the keys like they might disappear. I didn't talk about my father. Not directly. But I carried that moment, the banquet, the joke, the silence, the salute with me. I always have. Not because I'm still wounded by it, but because it marked the turning point. That was the moment I stopped waiting to be seen and started choosing to be clear. My father still sends updates. Short ones. Articles clipped from the local paper. A photo of a dog he adopted from a shelter. Notes about a neighbor who'd served in Korea. Occasionally, he forwards something about the VA and asks, "Is this accurate?" I respond when I have time. Sometimes a full sentence. Sometimes just a yes or looks right. The relationship exists. Barely. But it's functional. On my terms. We haven't had a long conversation in over a year. And I'm okay with that. He knows the door isn't closed. But it's not wide open either. We've both stopped pretending that some magical reconciliation is coming. That's not how this ends. This ends in realism. In boundaries. In choosing how much of yourself to offer someone who only recently learned how to hold it. And that, to me, is peace. When I think about legacy now, I don't think about plaques or panels. I think about our housing units in rural counties where services used to vanish. I think about the policy changes our team helped push through, ones that no one outside our field even knows about, but that keep a veteran from falling through the cracks. I think about the young staff we've mentored, who go on to lead new programs, new coalitions. And I think about that moment, all those years ago. The banquet hall. The laughter. The burn of hearing someone who helped raise me reduce me to a punchline. I remember how it felt to freeze in that chair. How it felt to stand. How it felt when Delaney walked through the door, looked right at me, and saluted. That moment didn't fix anything. But it cleared the fog. It reminded me that sometimes the people who owe you the most recognition are the least equipped to give it. And that doesn't mean you're invisible. It just means you're not looking in the wrong direction anymore. There's a photo from the night of the VA award, me standing on stage, holding the plaque. In the background, Delaney's standing to the side, arms crossed, faint smile on his face. He didn't need to be there, but he was. When the ceremony ended, I shook hands with half the room, posed for photos, answered questions. I got back to the hotel close to midnight, kicked off my shoes, and dropped the plaque on the desk like it was just another file to be reviewed. Then I sat on the edge of the bed, took a breath. Not because I needed to process anything, but because I finally had the space to just be still. I thought about all the nights I spent sitting in my car outside his house, exhausted from errands he never thanked me for. The calendars I managed, the phone calls I made, the meals I reheated. And I thought about now. About a system I helped shape, a team I helped grow, lives we've shifted, even if only by degrees. I don't need a rewrite of the past. I just needed to stop living in it. And I did. That's the legacy. Not the recognition. Not the award. The boundary. The shift. The quiet moment where you stop chasing the version of love you were taught to earn and start accepting the kind that meets you where you are. You don't need your father's respect to be worthy. Sometimes, it's the stranger in the room, the one who sees the substance beneath the silence, who reminds you who you really are. And sometimes, that's enough. If you've ever had to step back from family to protect your sanity, you know how hard that choice can be. But sometimes, distance is the only way to find clarity. What about you? Have you ever been written off by someone who should have had your back? Did they ever try to make it right? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. And if this hit close to home, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your peace is worth protecting.